I'm playing y'all pseudo. Always the same shit. Pseudo killers. Slide on a pseudo any day of the week. Got them running scared, demonstrating their weak. Turning up the pressure, now they feeling the heat. I'm stopping all these niggas, man, call it a feat. I got my Nike song, I run these YouTube streets. We're racking up the bodies, man, one at a time. I leave a bloody mess at the scene of the crime. Hunting through the blood, I'm always on my grind. Call me single love, got one thing on my mind. Die, pseudo, die, pseudo, die, pseudo, die. Nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. Die, pseudo, die, pseudo, die, pseudo, die. Ain't leaving no shells, don't need no alibi. Die, pseudo, die, pseudo, die, pseudo, die. I can see the fear hiding in your eye. Science is undefeated and we standing tall. Crushing all the scammers, building narrative wall. All that flim flamming, what's wrong with y'all? Swing my battle axe and we watch them fall. I leave them busted, battered and bruised. Crushing fragile egos, they call it abuse. I'm putting belt to ass, it's like you're born to lose. You're about to pop a vessel, about to blow a fuse. Your niggas always thinking, but I'm never confused. I'm hunting through the blood, I'm always on my grind. Call me single love, got one thing on my mind. Die, so die, so die, so die. Nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. Die, so die, so die, so die. Ain't leaving no shells, don't need no alibi. Die, so die, so die, so die. I can see the fear hiding in your eye. I see all the hating, it's fine by me. You pseudo-laying scammers are my enemies. All the misinformation is a tragedy. Now I'm in them garden pulling up the weeds. Y'all be the sickness like a fucking disease. I'm a pseudo-killer nigga, got the remedy. So I do this for fun, completely for free. Or watch a pseudo die, it's joy for me. So I'm always pseudo hunting, I'm always on the grind. Call me single love, got one thing on my mind. Die, pseudo die, pseudo die, pseudo die. Nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. Die, pseudo die, pseudo die, pseudo die. Ain't leaving no shells, don't need no alibi. Die, pseudo die, pseudo die, pseudo die. I can see the fear hiding in your eyes. Y'all just ain't ready to deal with a pseudo killer nigga. You gotta come with all your flim flam, bullshit, narratives, get crushed every time. Stomping on you niggas every time.
Wow. Shout out to my nigga Cedric, the chief executioner of Lucifer. Nigga holding it down. Just caught a body this week. You know what I'm saying? Caught a body Saturday. Smoked my nigga Courtney. Got Courtney the fuck up out of here with the Exodus narrative. Y'all know how we rocking, man. So tonight I just wanted to touch on the Torah being fictive real quick. I'm just gonna go to one of my sources here and just read from it. We just gonna read, man, because y'all know, man. Y'all been following for a minute. Y'all know that this whole program, you know what I'm saying, is backed up with by reading, by books, man, and sponsored by our friends at Reading Rainbow.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere, friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. A reading rainbow.
So we're gonna do what the religious zealots refuse to do, and that's actually read some meaningful literature tonight. You know, that's what we're gonna do. I won't be too long. I don't need to be too long to make this point. I'm gonna go to Fravel's book. We're gonna read from Fravel's book, A History of Israel. and we're going to read about these narratives because, we've been arguing and going back and forth in the back chat, so these people can't take a loss, saying these losses be hurting them. They be hurting their souls, So you got one side that's upset, but look at what you're trying to defend. That's what I'm trying to get you to see. You're trying to defend something that is indefensible. You know what I'm saying? Especially when you debate somebody that's competent. That's at least aware enough to dispel these myths, these modern myths, right? So we're gonna start off with history of ancient Israel. We're gonna deal with the chapter Israel's prehistory. This is chapter 2 of History of Ancient Israel by Fravel, and we're going straight to chapter 2, Israel's prehistory. The reason why I wanted to read this tonight, man, because somebody, a little birdie, told me this morning, we provide primary sources, and then he began to put his foot in his mouth 1,000 times, and I'm like, are you serious? The guy that believes that people were made from dirt, or the first man was made from dirt, and Sodom and Gomorrah is actual history. Like, are you serious? Noah's Ark. Like, we can go on and on and on. You're claiming to have a primary source. Real rich, real funny. That's some funny shit, right? That's hilarious. So let's just read into this about what we actually have, and as it relates to the narrative or the biblical narrative, right? So it starts off by saying Israel constitutes itself as a foreigner in the land of Palestine. From the biblical perspective of salvation history, Israel originated outside the land and had its roots in Mesopotamia. Genesis 12, 1 and 3, Deuteronomy 26 and 5, and Aram Naharaim. From Abraham via Isaac to Jacob, who was called Israel, Genesis 32, 29. It became a people in Egypt, Exodus 1, 7 and 9, which this is me talking sidebarring. If this is indeed the case, why we don't have no Egyptian documentation of a people known as Israel within Egypt? We don't have it, but that's purportedly where these people were called Israel or known as Israel. It says the people of the children of Israel entered the land of Canaan as a whole and took possession of it after the Exodus and the desert migration from the outside. A historical perspective depicts Israel's emergence in a completely different light. Israel developed in the land and not outside of it. And this is what was being explained by Cedric Ortega when he was debating with our brother Courtney. This was brought up and quite frankly ignored. It says not outside of it, in Egypt or in the desert, etc. And even this occurred over a long process. In order to make this basic assumption understandable, several steps of Israel's prehistory need to be outlined. Now we're going to go to the segment titled On the Historicity of the Patriarchs and the Matriarchs. And all of this here is basically him citing the sources that he's getting this information from. It says there are no contemporary sources about the prehistory of Israel and its ancestors, the matriarchs and patriarchs, which is what I was trying to tell someone this morning. There are no primaries, because in order to have a primary for any of these events and these people, then you would have to have direct attestation to that person, someone who lived that's contemporaneous, or the person himself or herself writing and recording it. We don't have that. So just it's a flat out lie to just sit up here and act like you guys are going off of primary sources. Like this was idiotic and moronic, if you ask me. It says, even though some of their names are documented as West Semitic personal names outside the Bible, the historicity of the biblical persons cannot simply be presumed. The only source is the book of Genesis, and what is told there is not to be understood historically, nor is it intended to be understood historically. And this is the issue that you guys are having, because everything is being seen through the lens of religiosity instead of the lens of history or empirical data, what we can actually prove. it's not being shown, it's not being utilized that way. And it's not just biblical believers, it's not just Black Hebrew Israelites, it's Afrocentrics, it's everybody that has these weird, spurious ideologies. It's flat earthers. They put themselves into a paradox where fiction and reality doesn't match. So what they do is they try to convince themselves or convince others that the fiction is actually reality, and that's the issue. It says the narratives collected there in clusters of traditions: Abraham cycle, Jacob Laban cycle, Jacob Esau cycle, etc., which according to the biblical chronology take place in the first half of the second millennium BC, mainly represent retrojections into the period before the constitution of the states of Israel and Judah. Meaning. They're retrojecting these things. They're writing. Somebody's writing it much later, and they're retrojecting motifs and ideas into the narrative, meaning they're writing into the story. This is not something that they're, this is actual history that's passed down. No, they're actually just creating the story and putting things into the story at a later date. Anyway, it says, yet these traditions were themselves only written during the period of these states and later. Exactly. The actual age of the traditions is currently the subject of much debate, but there's broad consensus that the written tradition of these ancestors do not date before the 8th century BCE. So this is the consensus. And, what's funny is I'm in a group with dilettantes, and, just to put it politely, and one of the dilettantes claims to be, I'm an academic superior. Well, here's the consensus. We don't have any evidence of these stories being written down prior to in the form that we have it in the scripture. It says there is a tendency to understand the Jacob traditions as being older than the Abrahamic Isaac traditions, that these traditions, whether oral or written, have preserved historical memories from the Middle Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age, 18th to 12th century BC, is very unlikely from what comparative ethnology can say about the transmission of collective memories. By denying the historicity of the biblical narratives, they are not devalued, but theologically valorized. The negation of direct historicity, the narratives about the patriarchs and matriarchs are not true in the historical sense. But this is hard for y'all to swallow, man. This is hard for you guys to swallow. You guys will always put your ideology over reality, and that's why you guys will continue to lose to Lucifer. You will continue to lose to Cedric, because at the end of the day, you can't separate the two. You can't separate fiction from reality. And this is why you keep getting your head bashed in. This is why I beat Pan. This is why I beat Hemi. This is why I beat Laurel. I mean, you guys are saying things that are utterly ridiculous. And it's because you can't get a good grasp on reality, because your ideology or your religiosity will not allow you to. It will not allow you to. It just doesn't allow for it. It says the narrative about the patriarchs and matriarchs are not true in the historical sense, raises the question of the function of the narratives, formation and constitution of Israel as a collective entity. And that's really what this is all about. It's about the ethnogenesis of Israel. They created a narrative to pretty much instill national pride and give them a sense of purpose and reasoning for doing what they're doing and going forward as a nation, right? So at present, the question is being discussed, especially for the Jacob narratives, to what extent they reflect the process of when the entity of Israel was literally formed in such a way that could constitute an ethnically homogeneous entity of Israel and collective memory. Nadav Navin, and he names Bloom and Theodore Sedell. This is Albright's hypothesis of the God of the ancestors. The peculiar names of God in Genesis have been cited as an argument for the historicity of the so-called patriarchs. Genesis not only mentions the God of your, my, or our father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Genesis 26, 24, 28, 13, 32, 10, 46, 1, and 3, 6, but also the fear of Isaac, Genesis 31, 42, and 53, and the mighty one of Jacob, 49, 24. In 1929, Alt developed the influential thesis of the God of the ancestors, a nomadic type of religion preceding the Yahweh religion, which, due to the attachment of God to the individual as a recipient of revelation, necessarily assumed the historicity of the patriarchs. This thesis has been vehemently contradicted. Since the texts do not really reflect a nomadic milieu, And the type of religion can be explained much more religiously than as an expression of individual family piety. Thus, the origin of the tradition from pre-state times cannot be guaranteed, nor can the possibility of the fiction be excluded. Abraham as a historical and fictitious person. The example of Abraham illustrates the problem. The name, which means he is sublime in relation to the father, is documented similarly in Amorite texts of the second millennium BCE, but there is no possibility of the identification with a person who immigrated from Ur of the Chaldees to Palestine. So my take on this, because I was supposed to be debating Greg Phillips on the existence of Abraham, and I see Leandre decided to debate Greg on the existence of Abraham. And one of the arguments people will go to was, well, I went to the onomastic argument. I even saw Leandre, even though he had a whole word salad in this debate and he was just rambling, he did go into the onomastic late in that debate. And that's usually the argument, like, well, we see the name being attested here. And then the other argument will be, oh, well, we see some of the historical references may have happened. He may, whoever wrote this had some knowledge of certain things that were happening in the Middle Bronze. So, these arguments are weak arguments. They're not smoking guns. Anyway, now to touch on the immigration part, now this may have the historical kernel of the Canaanite people pretty much trying to retell how they migrated into the Levant, because we do know that a large influx of Caucasus hunter-gatherers from the Trans-Caucasus region did make their way down into what we now know as Canaan, and these two became intertwined with each other. And this is why during the time of Thutmose and during the time of certain Egyptian pharaohs and patriarchs, they would write and record Canaanites down as the Hurru or Hurrians, right? Because these two seem to be at least connected. And we can see in the DNA profile of these people, they were literally connected, because the Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA is literally about 50% of their autosomal makeup, and the autosomal makeup of these people living during this time in these regions, all across these regions. Like, you can pick whatever sites you want to pick in ancient Israel. All of them have Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA. Anyway, so is there a history of them immigrating? Yes. The issue is, and this is me saying this is not the book. I'm sidebarring here just off the information that I know and I've studied and I gathered. The issue is they're trying to condense all of that history, that migratory history, into one individual named Abraham. That's the problem, because the migrations from outside of Canaan did happen, but it wasn't one person. It was waves. It was post-migrations, waves and waves of people coming in from the Caucasus region, going south. And we can see it in the Karaxis culture. We can see the spread of it. We can see the Hurrians. We can see these people moving north to south, down into Canaan. And this is why some of them even have Hurrian names. And then the cherry on the cake is always going to be DNA showing the Caucasus, the great influx of Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA coming into Israel around 5,000 years ago. So, as it's transitioning from the Copper to Bronze Age, we see that. So, could this be a story that's trying to tell at least some type of historical truth? Yes, the historical truth is not Abraham himself, it's the migration. That there was a migration coming from outside of that. Is it necessarily heir to child? No, it's just the Trans-Caucasian region in general where these people were, and they make their way south. Anyway, those are some bars from Chess Within My Heart is Yes. So to continue reading, it says the reference of the Ugaritic personal name Abarim is still unclear and does not help. Further, it may be mentioned that Pharaoh Sethos I, 1279 BC, boasts that he fought the Asiatics of Raham at Bethshan Tel El Hosen, small or second Bethshan Stele. If this is a reference to a group of Shashu, pastoralists, and subsistence farmers in the area of Yarmout, which remains unclear. The progenitor could have been called Abraham. Not only does that remain a historically vague assumption, but the connection to the biblical Abraham, whose traditions are rather anchored in South Palestine, could only be at best tenuously associated with it. Even if the names of the persons have been used as group names and the names are West Semitic, it cannot be excluded that these are fictitious persons who are made into eponyms where the name stands for groups. For example, Jacob for the Jacob clan or Judah for the tribe of Judah. Moving on to the next segment, the evidence of the tribe Smuel and the Assyrian sources. So Smuel is pretty much, I think Ishmael. I believe it's Ishmael. Anyway, let's keep reading. It says a good second example is the possible trace of Ishmael, in the sources, which is taken as proof for the existence of the patriarchs. The starting point is the linguistic connection between the name Ishmael and the Proto-Arabic name Smuel, which is assumed to be the same meaning. God El answers or has answered. The name Samael is attested in Akkadian sources of the Neo-Assyrian period into the 8th or beginning of the 7th century BC for a Proto-Bedouin tribe of a tribal confederation located mainly in the Nephut Desert in northern Arabia. The city of Duma was its center. The name was quite important as one of the gates of Nineveh is named the wealth of Samael enters here. Whether it's a single tribe or a Proto-Arabic tribal confederation is debated, although there is no positive evidence that the tribe of Smuel was also present in the western Negev. The relation of the biblical Ishmael and Smuel, which goes back to Franz Delitzsch, but was prominently advanced by Ernest Axel Knopf, is widely accepted in research. However, there is a chronological difference between the extra biblical sources and the biblical account. This chronological difference makes it impossible to recognize the biblical Ishmael as the historical ancestor of those tribes. 4 possibilities remain. There was no confederation of tribes named Smuel at all, and the connection between the names Ishmael and Smuel is philologically unsound. The confederation of Smuel existed earlier or contemporaneously in the West and in the Western Negev, and the biblical texts refer to those earlier groups, historizing interpretation of old tradition. The confederation of these tribes named Smuel existed in both places at different times, historizing interpretation of 2 separate but related traditions. The confederation of Smuel existed only in northern Arabia and is only alluded to in the biblical text by displacing it geographically and temporally. Thus, no real Ishmaelites ever existed historically in the neighborhood of Abraham and in the Negev. Tribe of Smuel in the 8th century is historical. The existence of Ishmaelites in the Middle Bronze Age is a biblically invented tradition that emerged in the 8th or 7th century BCE later. And that's what we're going to see. That's going to be a common theme. This is what's going to be a common theme here. We're going to keep saying a lot of these things are latter inventions. Yes, they're drawing and extrapolating from names that are actual names. They're even extrapolating from actually known, areas and geography. But the story, the characters, it's being invented. And this is what we see in the Torah. And this is why the Torah is largely fictive. Next segment, Yaqub equals Yaqub Elu and its possible link to ancient Israel. Within the stories of Genesis 12 through 50, there is a strong link between the biblical patriarch Jacob and Israel, particularly because Jacob is renamed Israel twice in Genesis 32 and 29 and Genesis 35 and 10. In prophetic passages, the names Israel and Jacob are often used in parallel or even synonymously. Therefore, it is obvious to look for the historical origin of this equation. The name Jacob is assumed to be a shortened version of the Theophoric name Jacob El, a name frequently attested as Yaqub Elu, Yaqub El, in ancient extra-biblical sources. And just real quick sidebar, we're going to see the same thing with Moses. Even Moses' name is most likely Theophoric, but for some reason, whoever wrote this down or the surviving text that did get copied, they most likely elided or removed the Theophoric part of his name. And the reason why a lot of scholars believe this to be the case is because when you look at this name being used in Egypt, a majority of the time, if it's not a child, because I know the name can be a nickname for a child, Courtney was telling me there was a later discovery that happened this year of somebody named Moses or something of that nature. That's the exception of the rule. Majority of the time, we see it attached to a god, Thutmoses, Ramesses, that like Ra Moses. However, that's always like born of a god, drawn out from a god, or however you want to transliterate that, right? There's always an association. It's a theophoric name in most cases. So it seems that the biblical writers redacted that and removed whatever deity that may have been attached to his name. Same thing here with Yaqub. When we see Yaqub in the archaeological record, when we see it attested, it's Yaqub Elu, right? It has the L attached to its name. So just something to note right there. It says particularly the attestation of Yaqub Elu in list of toponyms from Thutmoses III, 1479 to 1423 BCE, Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, and Ramesses III, 1183 to 1151 BCE, has attracted scholars, and some argue for locating the mentioned region in Gilead and or Transjordan, since Israel is also attested in Egyptian sources, albeit as a group of people. The argument sometimes links Israel in a very early stage with Jacob. Accordingly, it is assumed that clans of Jacob El joined the Israelite people by the late 13th century BCE. The figure of the patriarch Jacob thus supposedly reflects the early history of Israel. However, there is simply no link between these two in existing Egyptian sources, so that this hypothesis remains mere speculation. This is true even more so for the connection of Yaqub Elu with the early history of Yahweh, the later God of Israel, since the sources mention the name Yaqub Elu alongside names with elements Q-X, which is then linked to the later Edomite deity Quos. This is evaluated as an early testimony of the God of Israel. However, the presupposed relation or even equation of Quos and Yahweh is rather a speculative point in this argument. In short, there is no sure way to identify the connection of Jacob and Israel in any sources before the biblical traditions. The identification, which is confirmed very late explicitly via the renaming in Genesis, must be explained from the biblical tradition itself. So again, we're hitting this brick wall because a lot of this stuff is just being invented. They're taking real world things and they're putting their own twist to it, right? It says, in sum, it cannot be proven or excluded that there have been historical persons named Abraham, Sarah, Ishmael, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, and so on. Whether these then also stand behind the narrative traditions of the patriarchs and matriarchs is another question. Many indications suggest that the biblical tradition constructs rather than reflects the period of the ancestors. Constructs, meaning they invented this. Doesn't reflect the period. They invented these things. Later invention. Migrations in the Bronze Age is the next segment. Researchers often presume large migratory movements of people groups as informing the historical background of the Abraham narrative. But even this can find no point of historical verification. Neither climatic nor political changes can be proven to have led to ethnic mass movements in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE in the southern Levant. The demographic changes in Palestine in early, middle, and late Bronze Ages for the epochal terms were not due to large-scale migrations of people, but to changes in forms of settlement, that is, the social economically justified change between urban and rural forms of life. Thus, some Amorite and Aramean migrations as the background of the patriarchal and matriarchal narratives as invalid for the 2nd millennium BCE. Mass migrations are not movements of short duration, but usually represents a longer process of resettlement of a group of people. It was not foreign population that invaded Palestine or Syria. Rather, it was smaller population groups changing their way of life and their place of residence due to environmental factors such as local periodic droughts. However, major climatic changes are so slow that shifts in settlement patterns can be only detected over a long period of time from the complex process of the 2nd millennium BCE, which are characterized by strong political change. The small states in Greater Syria, Palestine area emerged. Now, real quick for me to sidebar here, this is true for the 2nd millennium BC, not for the 3rd or the 4th going into the 3rd, because again, as I mentioned earlier, we do know we see waves of Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA there. Before this period, in the Chalcolithic period, we only see a majority of early Levantine or Natufian-like DNA. So this is true for second millennium BC. What impact does this have on the Torah? It has a lot of impact on the Torah because it's pretty much a lot of these migrations and movements about Abraham coming down is pretty much assumed that this is happening in the Middle Bronze. You know what I'm saying? So if it's happening in the Middle Bronze, we really don't see evidence for that in the Middle Bronze, is what they're pointing out here. It says the migrations of patriarchs was caused by historical and literary growth of narratives into narrative cycles, not by actual or historical migrations of people. The attempt to visualize them on a map borders on the grotesque. It is striking that the Abraham Lot narratives are located almost continuously in the south, and important places are Beersheba, Mamre, Hebron, while the Jacob Esau cycle is anchored in the central Palestine and Transjordan. Whether this local distribution looks back to tribal traditions and background, Abraham tradition from the Leah tribes and Jacob tradition from the Rachel tribes, it's controversial due to the fact that the writing of the tradition occurred much later. Again, it's going to be a repeated theme in this book. None of this stuff is, contemporary. There's a lot of things that are being assumed or invented much later. It said the assignment of Jacob Esau narratives to the north and Abraham narratives to the south remains relatively certain. At any rate, a historical evaluation for the pre-state period cannot be justified at the current state of the discussion. The next segment, the late Bronze Age city-state in Palestine. So, oh man, we're creeping ever closer to the fictitious Exodus. Anyway, emergence and evolution of city-states in the second millennium BC. In second millennium BC, after a non-urbanized period at the end of the third millennium BC, 2200 to 2000 BCE, the entire Levant experienced a renewed urbanization. The cities, some of which were built on top of the ruins of early Bronze Age city complexes, were founded in two phases, 20th and 18th century BC, and existed until the late Bronze Age around 1200 BC. With a few exceptions in mountainous regions, Shechem, Tel Balata, Jerusalem, and in Transjordan, Zariah, Peah, Tabaquat, Fahil, Tel El Hussein, Tel Der Allah, Tel El Umeri, Amman. The late Bronze Age urban complexes in Palestine were built along major traffic routes, predominantly in the Cisjordan plains. That is in the coastal plains. For example, from the north to the south, Akzib, Dor, Tel Mubarak, Ashdod, Tel Mor, Hadar, Ashkelon, Tel El Agul, Sadaruhin, and the adjacent Shapala, and around Jezreel Plain, and in Belshan Basin. The city complexes were not large. On average, they had a settlement of about 5 hectares. This corresponds to a square area whose sides are about 225 meters. As a rule, no more than 2,000 people lived in the cities. This is another thing I brought up with Courtney. I'm like, you do know that the population of Canaan was very small, very small. So you're saying 50,000 people come in, like, we don't have no record of that, like a large influx of people just coming in like that. And these people, it's very small. Now, mind you, we're at the 22 to 2000 BC to 1800 BC. But even when we get to the 13th century, it doesn't really grow that much, right? Anyway, it says only in individual cases the cities reach a larger extent. As a rule, the urban area included a hinterland that was least politically, economically, and culturally influenced, in most cases even controlled to varying degrees on dependency. The surrounding settlements, which formed a periphery of a city, were usually no more than a day's journey away, which pragmatically limited the size of the city-states. The smaller settlements assigned to the city formed a city-state and encompassed a wide territory. Lachish, Tel, Ed-Duer, and the Shephelah, for example, was the largest city in the south, apart from the Philistine cities on the coast, despite its relatively moderate but still considerable size of circa 7 hectares. The city's sphere of influence reached around 25 surrounding settlements in an area almost 1,000 kilometers square, or more than 30 hectares of populated area. Calculating based on a population coefficient of about 200 people per hectare of populated area suggests 6,000 inhabitants in the late Bronze Age city of Lachish. This corresponds roughly to the comparable city-states in Syria. The cities, or rather city-states, were comparable in social structure, political and economic infrastructure, and the like, and were in variety of relationships and competitions with each other. They formed regional networks, but at the same time, they were separate from each other. As a rule, they did not form clusters or city alliances that belonged together, but acted on their own foreign and domestic policy, albeit not without context. The strong fragmentation did not allow the city-states to act together, which made them appear weak in the face of expansive empires such as Egypt or the Hittite Empire. So that gives you a little backdrop. It's not as exciting as the world flooding, huh? A global flood and animals and Abraham. You had these band of warriors and Esau and Jacob and all of these tales that you read in Genesis. It's not as exciting. Religion and society in the late Bronze Age cities. This is a very interesting part too, as well, because when you look at these people, they were very polytheistic. They believed in multiple deities and multiple gods. What the Bible is prescribing or describing is fairly new. It's not something that these people would have been accustomed to. But anyway, religion and society in the late Bronze Age cities. The cities were economically integrated into long-distance trade and had a stratified social structure. Besides the peasants who mostly lived in the cities, but also in the surrounding area, there were slaves, day laborers, craftsmen, and merchants, as well as small ruling upper class comprising influential families, officials, and priests. The supreme representative was a city lord or local king whose family was particularly prominent and involved in government affairs. The position of king was hereditary, which also kept the clientele relations to the influential family stable for a long time. The king granted the rights to manage the surrounding countryside to the urban elite. The economy and society was thus thoroughly determined by one central authority. All the resources of the city-state ultimately served to preserve and promote the expanded royal budget. Offices and prominent positions of the leadership elite were based on kinship and heredity. The king was regarded in a special way as representative of the supreme god in the regional pantheon. So you got a pantheon. Pantheon. These people are polytheistic. These are the ancestors of your Israelites, right? These people were not monotheistic, or a lot of you guys get slick and say henotheistic. These people believed in multiple gods. That's just a fact of history. I don't know why the reason why you want to twist and distort history is because you're trying to retroactively put Genesis into these periods, but it just does not fit. It's like putting a square peg into a round one. The city temples, usually one or more temples determined the cityscape, had regional significance. The respective cults between the cities were similar with regard to gods and goddesses, rituals, and ritual experts in their symbol systems, but the individual city cults were at the same time characterized by regional or local peculiarities. Here's a map of Israel here, or Canaan. It says, unlike the biblical depiction, there was no such thing as the Canaanite religion, which the Israelites would have found upon their arrival in the land. The Canaanites and their religion are stylized in the biblical text as contrasting foils. De facto, the early Israelite religion was not very different from the religions of the Canaanite city-states. And I was trying to explain to a moron this morning, but he don't listen. So I got to just go read from an expert that's citing a lot of more experts. Because these people act like they're the authority. So I'm reading from these people that have been studying this shit their whole goddamn life. And this is what they come up with. This is what they found in the research. The early Israelite religion was not very different from the religions of the Canaanite city-states. Right? There you go. There you go. Whoop, there it is. Whoop, there it is. From a religious historical perspective, these did not have a uniform religion, but nevertheless comparably structured pantheon, families of gods. These people were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. It says in which gods of different origin were worshipped. Usually a god or a pair of gods was at the head of the local family of gods, but not in all cities. For example, in Ugarit, El was the supreme city god. And someone asked me, show me El as a god. I mean, I'm like, Y'all claim to be these bookworms. Y'all claim to be these superior scholars, and you say shit like that. And I don't know why y'all say it to me, because I'm the one nerd that will sit and read this shit on my free time. I do it live. I'm the one person that will actually read through this. And then y'all come up and y'all play in my face, man. This would be crazy. It says, often the names of the cities show connection to the highest city god, sun god Samas, and Beth Shemesh, the moon god Yori, and Jericho, the defined evening star Salem, and Jerusalem. And this is what we were talking about too, that, a lot of these names were pre-existing before there was anything called an Israelite. We see Jericho, we see Jerusalem, we see these things. But often there is also no connection between the place name and the revered highest deities, Makal, Anat, and Bet-Shean. In the late Bronze Age, the presence of Egyptian deities strongly increased, which was related to the Egyptian dominance in the region. Emergence of Egyptian supremacy during the New Kingdom. A brief historical overview shows the political constellations. After the expulsion of the Hyksos, at the end of the 16th century BCE, Egypt expanded into the so-called New Kingdom. Egypt, 18 to the 20th dynasty, 1550 to 1070, 69 BCE. With renewed strength toward Palestine in southern Syria, first under Ahmose, 1550 to 1525 BCE, who occupied the Hyksos capital Avaris and besieged Saruhan for 3 years. Thutmose the first, and again, I have to put emphasis on this. This is when we actually have record of Egyptians chasing Canaanites, right, out of Egypt, up the Sinai. This is when we see it right here in this period. We don't see it in Ramesses or Thutmose at this time. So there goes your Exodus narrative there. That, for all you guys that were Exodus hopefuls. Thutmose is the first, 1504 to 1492, advanced to the Euphrates. The Canaanite rulers lost their independence and became vassals of the Egyptian Empire. And this is why a lot, including Redford, would say that they wrote the Exodus narrative to make it to be symbolic of being free of Egyptian rule, because the Egyptians literally ruled Canaan for quite some time, and that's what we're reading about. It says the high point of the 18th dynasty expansion policy occurred under Thutmose III. Initially, the affairs of the government were conducted by Hatshepsut, Thutmose II's wife, whose successful policy was directed toward the expansion of trade relations and internal stabilization. During his 22nd year of reign, Thutmose III fought a battle against a coalition of Canaanite and Syrian princes under the leadership of the feeble enemy of Kadesh at Orontes, which the pharaoh repulsed at Megiddo. And it goes on to say, in the first decades of his regency, Thutmose III undertook campaigns to the Near East almost annually in order to secure the achieved supremacy. At the same time, he wanted to protect himself against the expansive desires of the Indo-Aryan Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, which had been growing in strength in Habor area of northern Mesopotamia since the 15th century BCE. The Egyptian presence in Via Maris along the coast was strategically expanded in Gaza, Ashkelon, Nakura, and strengthened inland by Egyptian garrisons in Beth-Shean, and Kumidi. Under Thutmose III, no formal, even only temporary peace agreements with Mitanni seem to have been reached, but the somewhat later correspondence at the royal court of Amarna testifies to manifold diplomatic relations. The successor, Menephis II, who was initially co-regent alongside his father for 3 years, rarely needed to reach out to Palestine and Syria because the Egyptian supremacy over Palestine was largely secure. However, the kingdom of Mitanni, pushed back by Thutmose III, established itself more and more as an important power in his 7-year, and Menephis II seems to have suffered a defeat against Mitanni beyond the Orontes. The ruler Hanagal Bat, as the kingdom of Mitanni is called in Akkadian texts, attacked northern and central Syria, but were increasingly under pressure from the Hittites. Thus, agreement Thus, an agreement was reached by Thutmose IV, which was sealed with a diplomatic marriage between the daughter of Aratama and the Egyptian pharaoh. But the balance of power soon shifted again due to the influence of the Hittites. The Hittite Suppiluliuma. Oh man, that's a tongue twister right there. Defeated King Tusrata of Mitanni and extended the Hittite influence to northern Syria. In Mesopotamia, on the other hand, the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit regained independence and conquered Mitannian territory in the north. The Egyptian influence in Syria, Palestine began to wane. It was not until the Ramessides of the 19th dynasty that a new consolidation phase began for Egypt's foreign policy, leading to Egypt's renewed supremacy under Sethos I and Ramesses II. Sethos I promptly marked his claim in his first year of reign in 1290 BCE by a campaign to Palestine. This is evidenced, for example, by the Stela and Beth Shean, in which the pharaoh boasts that he saved the region from the hands of the enemy who was expanding southward from Syria. His successes against the Hittites, however, remained selective at first, leading to a balance of power. In 1275 BCE at Kadesh on the Orontes, Ramesses II and a large army, partly comprised of mercenaries, including the Palastu, marched against the Hittites under King Muwatalli II. The battle had no clear winner. Even Ramesses II propagandized it in the Thebes by all the means by his disposal. Excuse my reading. I'm getting tripped up by all these multi-syllabic words, these foreign Muwatalli names. It's really throwing me off, but bear with me. It says, according to the Egyptian representation, the pharaoh, of course, won gloriously. Upon the pharaoh's retreat, Muwatalli seemed to have followed him and temporarily brought the Egyptian province of Upe under his control. It was not until 1259 BCE, in the 21st year of Ramesses II, that a peace treaty was concluded with the Hittite Hattusili II. Palestine became a border region between Egyptian and Hittite rule. So we had to learn all that history about the Egyptians having that control, how long it lasted, when did it wane. So that's why we read that. Now we're moving on to the segment, the so-called Sea People and the loss of Egypt's supremacy. The last phase of the late Bronze Age was marked by the collapse of the Hittite Empire in the late 13th century BCE in the wake of invasion of the Sea Peoples from the Aegean and South Anatolia, against whom even the Egyptian Empire under Ramesses III could only withstand with difficulty. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, Egypt reacted to the loss of power by strengthening the garrisons in Palestine, which is weird. So where do we see this mentioned in the book of Judges? Where do we see this mentioned in the book of, I don't know, Joshua, Numbers, something like, why we don't see this mentioned? That we see a strengthening of the garrisons in Palestine. Shouldn't one of the biblical writers have made note of that? But we don't see that. And the reason why we don't see that, because the narrative was invented much later, not during the actual events, what was going on. It's obviously not contemporaneous, because we do see this during that period. And this will be the period by some of these biblical scholars, people that believe in the event, will say is the time of the judges. So why we don't see this? It says the foreign policy of the Ramessides after Ramesses III weakened in the second half of the 20th dynasty, with the Syrian Palestinian provinces increasingly neglected, leading to a complete loss of foreign political supremacy in the 21st dynasty. The disappearance of Egyptian control was one of the prerequisites for the development of state structures in the first millennium BCE in the area of southern Palestine, Israel, Judah, Ammon, Moab, Edom. So you start seeing them pop up during this time. Why? Because now you don't have Egyptian control there no more, right? It said the first signs of which occurred in political consolidations in the coastal plains, Philistine and Phoenician city-states. The so-called Sea Peoples were not an ethnically homogeneous group and did not originate, as the name suggests, exclusively in coastal areas in the Mediterranean. Rather, the collective term Sea Peoples refers to a mixture of invasive ethnic groups, only some of which had their origin in the Aegean Sea, but partly also in the Balkans, Asia Minor, and the Near East. In Egyptian texts, the islands in the sea or the middle of the sea are indicated as the area of origin, which is why they are referred to in research as Sea Peoples. Beginning in the 14th century BC, they formed massive coalitions that militarily influenced events from Anatolia via the southern Levant to Egypt, especially from the turn of the 13th to 12th century BCE. Sources from Ramesside period mentions various sea peoples as a threat to the Nile Delta. Already under Ramesses II, a chain of fortresses were built in the northern delta, but conflicts with the groups of sea peoples first occurred only in the 4th and 5th year of the Pharaoh Meneptah, when he attacked the west flank of the delta alongside Libyans. The text mentions Aquaza, Tersa, Etruscans, and Sardinians, and Cilicians, and Lycians, whereas the identification with the ethnic groups known from later texts are likely but not equally certain in all cases. Under Ramesses III, a second wave of invasion occurred, comprising a coalition of, among others, the Philistines, looks like Tajeker, and the Danaans, which is documented in a large wall reliefs at Medinet Habu, depicted the battle in Mediterranean. There are people that believe the Danaans would be where you get the tribe of Dan concept from in the Bible as well. That has been explored in academia before. So just let that be noted. Even if these sources suggest a highly invasive potential of the coalitions and associate it with the collapse of the Hittite Empire, as well as the relations of power in Syria and Cyprus, it is still unclear to what extent the seafaring people contributed to the economic political collapse of the empires, the conquest of Cyprus, the downfall of Ugarit, and other Syrian city-states, in particular the collapse of the Hittite Empire. For example, one must also take into account that the sea peoples were not only invaders, but could have previously played an important role in international long-distance trade. To what extent the settlement of sea peoples in the southern Levantine coastal strip was part of Egyptian foreign policy, or was simply the consequence of the declining Egyptian influence in Palestine, remains controversial. Whether caused by Egyptian politics or not, the settlement of population groups of sea peoples in southern Levant belongs to the emergence of the Philistines, even if their origin is far more complex. Israel as part of the Egyptian province of Canaan. Are they making progress? We had to get all that backdrop, the historical backdrop, to explain what's going on here. Marlo Ming says, can you share the name of this book or research paper again, please? I am late to the video. Thank you. Absolutely, Marlo. This is History of Ancient Israel by Frevel. And I will actually put it in the chat for you. Just give me a second. Type it in the chat before we continue, and you guys can have it. And we're in chapter 2. In regards to Israel's prehistory is what we're covering right now. So I don't have to. Yeah, History of Ancient Israel by Christian Frevel. So this is how it's spelled. I'll put it on the screen briefly. History of Ancient Israel, Christian Frevel. And again, we're in chapter 2. And the chapter is titled The Prehistory of Israel. So this is why we're reading all of this. This is why we went over the role that ancient Egypt had, the firm rule that they had. When did it end? It started in the 18th dynasty, ended in the 21st dynasty, about 1070 BCE. And now we're moving to the segment dealing with Israel as part of the Egyptian province of Canaan. So here's the title of the book right here. History of Ancient Israel, Christian Frevel. So Marlo. How Music said, it's legend over embellished over any of the people, at least. And the New Testament historically existed in many places. The places are real. Yes, it's an embellishment of certain things that are real motifs or events. And then they invented a lot of the stuff that we see and we read in the Torah. A lot of that stuff was our later invention. But they're extrapolating from historical myths, Egyptian myths, and their knowledge of deities and worship and practices and stuff like that. They're extrapolating from those things. Those things are very much, real in the sense that those things existed prior to. But they're making this thing, they're making it into their own narrative to create their own ethnogenesis. We read that earlier. Now we're going to read the rest of this segment here. Israel is part of the Egyptian province of Canaan. Make sure you guys can see it. All right. The process of urbanization, expansion of urban centers, and the deurbanization, abandonment of cities in favor of rural settlement. In the second millennium BCE, in Syria, Palestine can be seen in the larger political context described above. The Egyptian presence in the Palestine region was decisive for the development and flourishing of the late Bronze Age urban culture, which can be understood as the southern extension of the Syrian city-state culture. Among the Egyptian administrative sites that were of particular importance for the organization of Egyptian rule in Palestine, Gaza stands out, where there was a temple of Amun that played an important role in the administration of the province. And Tel El Farah, south, and Tel Jamah, Tel Sarah, Tel El Hesi, Afek, and Beth Shean, representative buildings in Egyptian style have been found. Jaffa, Ashkelon, Gezer, Gath, Megiddo, and Lachish are also places with strong Egyptian presence. At this time, there was not yet a state entity, Israel, but in the area in which Israel later arose was part of the Egyptian province of Canaan. Especially in the Egyptian outposts, there was an alignment of the ancestral Canaanite culture with the Egyptian culture, particularly among the upper class, but also beyond that. The political situation in Palestine was determined by three factors. One, the Egyptian supremacy, which meant both protection and independence. Number two, the relative political autonomy that led to rivalries among the city-states. And number three, the threat of the Aporu or Haparu, looting non-urban population elements that are often called outlaws. The various individual city-states did not form an agnostic association, that is, an association connected by kinship or the construction of a common genealogy, but were in a relationship of cooperation and competition. And this is in huge contrast with the narrative, because again, the narrative is based off kinship. It's the Moabites around Moabites, the Israelites are all around Israelites, the Ishmaelites built among Ishmaelites, and that's just not historically accurate for anybody, because majority of people are hodgepodges. And we do see some elements in the book of Exodus of that, because it says a mixed multitude, which would be more accurate to what we see in Canaan or any other region for that matter. It said it was the relationship that united the political situation under the hegemonic power of Egypt, which dominated in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, following the establishment under Thutmose III, rather than the consciousness of being Canaan. The Amarna correspondence and the Aparu Haparu. The Amarna correspondence in particular provides information about the overall political situation in Palestine during the late Bronze Age. The documents from El Amarna consist of 379 letters from the local rulers of the areas ruled by Egypt, including the Syro-Canaanite city lords of Byblos, Beirut, Sidon, Tyre, Akko, Ashkelon, Megiddo, Gezer, Lachish, and Jerusalem. The letters were sent to the Egyptian ruler Amenephis III during the 14th century BC. They were found in 1887 in the administrative district of Tel Amarna, which is south of Cairo, which was the residence of Amenephis IV as the new capital of the 18th dynasty. Now, I was talking to a buffoon earlier, and he was like, how you know that the Amarna letters are primary sources? It's written in the time period. Y'all don't know what the word primary source means, but your question asking other people what does it mean? Makes no damn sense. It's literally a contemporaneous document. It says here, they provide information about the organization of the Egyptian province of Canaan, which was administered from Gaza, and about the political situation at the beginning of the detachment from the Egyptian supremacy. The Aparu Haparu were probably migrants of different origins who formed groups to create new, not necessarily agnostic social alliances in the district of the Canaanite city-states, often in the surrounding mountainous hinterlands, and secured their livelihood through looting, raids, and extortion. Like the Shasu nomads, who lived as peasants in non-urban regions, they were not a closed ethnic group, but had the status of living on the fringes of urban society. The Aparu are documented in texts of the second millennium BCE for the southern Levant, in the texts of Nuzi, Mari, the Ugarit, Alak, and in numerous Egyptian texts, and are considered as a disruptive element in the polymorphic society of the late Bronze Age city-states. In the Amarna correspondence, much is reported about the disputes between the cities in the Aparu, These were branded as the political adversaries and troublemakers, not least to emphasize the loyalty of the city kings to the Egyptian overlords so that the disputes between the cities themselves appeared less dramatic. So we're going to move on from that. I was going to make, commentary. A lot of people will use the Aporia as saying the Aporia somehow. That's the Exodus. After the Exodus, that's Joshua and Judges and all that other stuff. A lot of people do that. That's not history either. That's just you grasping for straws and trying to put a square peg in a round one. Anyway, let's keep going. 2 examples for the regional development of urban culture. A brief glance at 2 regions should make this clear. These are deliberately not examples from the heartland of the cities in the plains, but 2 landscapes that later play a major role in settlement development in the Iron One period. Galilee as well, the Manasseh Hill Country and Judean Hill Country. While Galilee in the late Bronze Age had some important sites, only in the lower southern part, Upper Galilee was largely inhabited only in the early and middle Bronze Ages. Only a larger settlement at Tel Rose, which according to Gal can be identified at Beth Anat. It is also mentioned in the Amarna correspondence played a larger role. A letter of the king Abdi Milkai of Tyre reports concerning the territory of Upper Galilee that the area was disputed between the kings of Hazor and Tyre and inhabited only by groups of the Aporia. The Aporia also lived outside the city belt in the more inaccessible forests and mountain regions. The fact they were an important factor in the conflicts also emerges from the second example, the Manasseh and Judean Hill Country. In the Amarna correspondence, the ruler Labaayu is accused of controlling large parts of Canaan with his sons, distributed the land to the Haparu and attacking other cities. Although it's not clear where the residence of Labaayu was based on the new analysis of the tone letters, it is likely that he resided in Shechem. The nearby city-states of Tel Shimron, Tel Astara, and Gezer belong to the network formed by Labaayu through diplomatic alliances, while the neighboring ones in Megiddo, Tel Rahov, and the south and Jerusalem were not included. Through the inclusion of the Aporia, the network began to control the important trade routes from Egypt to Syria and Mesopotamia, and thus became a political danger for the Egyptian supremacy in Canaan. The coalition between cities and Aporia was certainly not a stable partnership. But the example of the accusations in the Amarna letters against Labaayu shows that the question of land suitability outside the cities also played an important role in the less densely populated regions themselves, and that Aporia were a decisive factor here. In addition, local development shows the great strategic importance of Jezreel Plain in the northern city belt. During the late Bronze Age, there were only 2 city-states in the central Palestinian highlands. Shechem, which was ruled by Labaayu, and Jerusalem, which was governed by Abdi Heba. 6 letters from the city king of Jerusalem have certainly been preserved, in which repeatedly complains bitterly about the Aporia, presenting them as a threat to the Egyptian hegemony and demanding troop support from the Pharaoh. The Aporia men have plundered all the lands of the king and would even take the cities of the Pharaoh, who was addressed as king. Through gifts of lands from enemy city kings, they were bribed and thus became a threat to the rule of Abdi Heba. As an example, the letter of Jerusalem city king is quoted in excerpts. There, Abdi Heba expresses his loyalty to the king named Pharaoh in diplomatic phrases and thus underlines the political as well as military dependence on the Egyptian sovereignty. Apparently, the Jerusalem ruler was suspected of not sufficiently consolidating Egyptian rule and deliberately causing the loss of hegemonic control. On the other hand, he claims to have done everything possible against the Aporia and blames the Egyptian commissioner Yemhamu for the loss of land. He was not allowed to withdraw troops, but had to strengthen them with the archers to protect the surrounding area and the lords of Jerusalem. Therefore, he urges the Pharaoh to take care of the land and to defend it against the attacks of the Aporia. And you guys can see why people try to make this correlation with, oh, this is after the Exodus, Amenhotep II, or Thutmose, and this is the judges' account, this is Joshua account, this is the Israelites ravishing the land. And again, we have no attestation of no Israelites here. It's not telling us anything. And again, this is not a group of people that are related. We've already established that. So there is no parallel here. Again, it's just people grasping at straws. It says here, speak to the king, my lord. And again, we got to stop this just trying to grasp at straws real quick before I continue reading. This place was already unstable. This place did have tribal conflict going even before this period. So it's like, you point out tribal conflict is not really telling us anything. It's too vague, right? It says, king to the king, my lord, thus Abihaba, your servant, at the feet of my lord, the king, 7 times, and 7 times have I fallen. What have I done to the king, my lord? They are maligning me. I am being maligned before the king, my lord. Abihaba has deserted the king, his lord. Look, as for me, neither my father nor my mother put me in this place. The strong arm of the king installed me in the house of my father. Why would I, of all people, commit a crime against the king, my lord? As long as the king, my lord, lives, I will say to the commissioner of the king, my lord, why do you love the Aporia and hate the city rulers? Thus I am maligned in the presence of the king, my lord, because I am saying, lost are the lands of the king, my lord. Thus I am slandered to the king, my lord. So may the king, my lord, be apprised that the king, my lord, placed a garrison here, but Yemhamu took all of it. May the king turn his attention to the regular troops so that the regular troops of the king, my lord, may come forth. The king has no lands. The Aporia men have plundered all the lands of the king. If there are regular troops in this year, there will still be lands of the king, my lord. But if there are no regular troops, the lands of the king, my lord, are lost. And that's translations of that letter there. Moving on to the Aporia and their connection with the Hebrews. Now, scholars do postulate a connection between these two, but it's not the way you guys are saying it. And I say you guys are Black Hebrew Israelites, a lot of believers, they will say, oh, well, this is actual retelling of historical events. Well, actually, the name may have survived as Hebrew, but it does not mean that that the events in Joshua and Judges or whatever and Numbers is true. This is what it's saying. It's saying that the name was extrapolated from that time period and may have survived as Hebrews. And that's what we're about to read about here. It says, although the situation in Amarna correspondence was clearly dramatized with respect to the Egyptian hegemonic power, it seems certain that the constellation of city-states and uninhabited peripheral zones presented a favorable environment for social conflicts between the city dwellers and non-settled population groups. But how much influence the Aporia actually had in the late Bronze Age, and what role they played in the decline of the city role cannot be clearly ascertained. The Aporia were one, but certainly not the sole triggering factor of the decline of the cities at the end of the late Bronze Age. What remains striking is that after the social and economic upheaval that led to the settlement of the mountainous regions, there is no more mention of marauding groups that were perceived as a threat by the cities. This holds true for the persisting urban structures, the so-called New Canaan, and for the emergent urban centers in the late Iron Age. The Aporia and Haporia disappeared from almost all available sources from the 12th and 11th century onward. In earlier research, this was interpreted as an indication that the Aporia and Haporia might be associated with the emergence of a new village culture. From a historical perspective, things are not so straightforward. The biblical term Hebrews, Ibram, or Hebrew, Ibri, which is derived from the verb br, to pass, by, through, or over, is a gentilic for a group of people related to the Israelites. It is used in the biblical narrative first with Abram, Genesis 14:13, a few times in Joseph's story, Genesis 39:14, 17, 40, 15, 41, 12, 43, 32, frequently in the non-priestly Exodus narrative through chapter 10, Exodus 1:15, 19, 2:7, 13, 3:18, 5:3, 7:69, 1, 13, 10, and 3, and sometimes in 1 Samuel in opposition to the Philistines. In at least 4 other passages, the term is used to qualify a slave as Hebrew, Exodus 21:2, Deuteronomy 15:2, Jeremiah 34:9 and 14. Finally, Jonah 1:9 takes up Exodus terminology as Jonah identifies himself as a Hebrew who worships Yahweh, the God of heaven. The distribution pattern raises the question of whether the term Hebrew represents an ancient connection to Israel, or if the term is rather a late terminological intrusion or redactional addition. The latter option stems from the fact that the Greek Hebraic is frequently used in the books of Maccabees and beyond to designate Israelites in their language, making this at least as plausible as the assumption of an old linguistic relic. However, an explanation has to be given for why the term is employed so specifically in the Exodus narrative in context of early Israel, even though there is no conclusive evidence to relate the Hebrews and the Proto-Israelites via the Aporu and Haparu. While the name Aporu and Haparu sound similar to the biblical name Hebrew, Hebrew and linguistic historical connection cannot be necessarily be excluded. The late Bronze Age Aporu and Haparu were neither simply Proto-Hebrews or even Proto-Israelites, nor did they demonstrably become simply Hebrews with the emergence of Israel. For such a monocausal derivation, the process of transition from the late Bronze Age to Iron Age is too complex. Christophe Bonner has suggested an alternative linguistic derivation of the term by relating it to a geopolitical term, Erenari, which was already in use in the Neo-Assyrian period to designate the area beyond the river, west of the Euphrates. The specific use of the term in a biblical context and lack of hard epigraphic or textual evidence from the 7th to 4th centuries BC stand against this identification. Perhaps a new epigraphic find also contradicts the proposal. In 2019, a Moabite inscription on the limestone incense altar was uncovered in Herbert, dating to the 9th to 8th century BC. One line reads, MNBRN, which can perhaps be related to the number of commodities from the Hebrews. However, the word may also be understood to refer to the place named Abarim. If the inscription indeed refers to the Israelites from a Moabite perspective, this will be the earliest extra-biblical attestation to the term Hebrews. So there you go. Aporu, Hebrew, do they have a connection? Is it a later redaction? Is it something that they just took and then it morphed to Hebrew because they have that memory of Haparu? It's still up in the air, but hey, that's how they're investigating. That's where they're at on that. The Shasu farmers as part of late Bronze Age society. Sociologically, besides the city dwellers in the Aporu, Haparu, the Shasu, pronounced Shashu, also played an important role in the late Bronze Age and are frequently mentioned in Egyptian texts. The Shashu, meaning wanderer, shepherd, were groups of pastoralists who lived semi-nomadically, that is, in tents and not permanently settled. Depending on the climatic and economic conditions, they shifted their grazing areas from the cultivated land in the dry season to the adjacent semi-arid marginal areas in the rainy season. The pattern between prolonged sedentariness, seasonal pasture change, and nomadism, as well as the degree of symbiotic connection with the urban culture, was regionally differentiated and depended on political, economic, and climatic factors. The Shashu lived in predominantly peaceful economic exchange with the cities, but in Egyptian sources, they, like Aporu, Haparu, were regarded as trouble spots. It goes on to read, occasionally there was also warlike conflicts between the Shasu and the cities. Their share in the total population was likely not insignificant, especially as the urban population in the late Bronze Age was considerably smaller compared to the Middle Bronze Age. This suggests that a part of the urban population had returned to the semi-settled form of existence. Like the Aporu and Haparu, they play an important role in the theories of Israel's historical emergence. For the Exodus, the Shasu, who at least in part dwelled in the Egyptian Nile Delta area in the 13th and 12th centuries, attained central importance. And you do, like we read before, there's certain people like Bitak that believe that the Shashu are proto-Israelites. So this is why they become of central importance. Next segment, Israel and Egypt in its earliest mention on the Stela of Merneptah. Possibly the oldest testimony of the name Israel found on a fragment of the statue base held in Berlin, in the Berlin Museum. Besides the mention of Ashkelon and Gaza, Canaan, the remaining text is uncertain. However, Israel can actually be read as Israel, and then this statue base dating to the time of Ramses II in the 19th dynasty represents the oldest attestation of the name. There's a lot of people know about the Merneptah Stela, not too many people know about the Berlin foot stele, which could be a little older than the Merneptah Stela, but it's still in dispute. So a lot of scholars don't invoke it. It says, however, Israel and the so-called Israel Stela of his son, Pharaoh Merneptah, is certain and quite prominent. The 3.1 high granite stela was built in Pharaoh Amenephis III, and probably in 1208 BCE was inscribed the second time on the back by Merneptah. The inscription reports the Libyan campaign from the Pharaoh's 5th year of reign and names in lines 26-28 besides the Libyan tribes, the Hatti, Gaza, Canaan, Ashkelon, Yanoam, Syria, and Israel as part of the defeated 9 bowls. Israel lies follow and has no seed. Israel is written in a group spelling, and unlike the neighboring geographic foreign designations, is identified as a determinative, suggesting a clan designation, i.e. a people instead of a land. And there's the image there in the Merneptah Stele. However, this does not completely exclude the possibility that Israel refers to a geographical area. What exactly was meant by the ethnic or social entity to be sought in Palestine in the conquest by the Egyptian pharaoh remains open to interpretation. The assumption of a Palestinian campaign by Merneptah seems possible, but other evidence is missing. The sequence of the names could indicate the direction of the campaign from south to north, but there's no clear order. Yenoam, which can be identified with a small piece of Tel Enam, Tel Yenam, southeast of the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, is listed directly before Israel. Cairo, which stands for the region of Palestine, Damascus, and the Phoenician coast, most often translated as Syria, is mentioned directly after Israel. This keeps the interpretation open for Israel as a geographical reference. Most likely, however, the change of the determinative toward Ashkelon, Gaza, and so on just describes a non-urban group, possibly Aporia, in central Palestine. The idea that the term Israel already represents a state or a sub-state entity or designates a Canaanite city-state can be largely ruled out, even if no secure information can be gained regarding entity and territorial location of tribal or clan composition of Israel. Since there are no references in the biblical tradition to a single tribe Israel, but to a pre-state tribal network, Judges 5, the later entity to whatever extent becomes obvious. Differently, it should also be noted that the entity Israel was considered by the Egyptians to be so important and referentially clear that it was mentioned in the stela next to the city-states. This applies regardless of whether Merneptah's campaign is to be understood as historically plausible, or whether the final passage is merely a universalized depiction of Egypt's expansive rule, which follows on a form of the depiction of the Libyan campaign, attempts to identify the group called Israel on reliefs in the Temple of Karnak, are not sufficiently plausible due to the strongly symbolic representational canon of Egyptian reliefs. The new settlements in the Ephraimite, Manassite, and Sumerian highlands, which could be associated with the emergence of Israel, fit geographically. Archaeologically, it can be proven that these began slowly at the earliest in the phase of the collapse of the late Bronze Age urban culture after 1250 BCE, and then developed gradually. In this respect, the mention of Israel in the Merneptah Stela provides more questions than answers. Although the earliest evidence of the name Israel does not prove its pre-state existence or the stay of Israel in Egypt as historical, the militarily expansive foreign policy of which Pharaoh boasts shows one of the reasons why Semites came to Egypt as prisoners of war. In addition, economic refugees repeatedly arrived in Egypt in periodic waves. Most likely, the name Israel is a compound comprising the god El, a prominent and widespread Canaanite deity in the late Bronze Age. Again, we're arguing with brothers about this. They don't want to accept this. This is the most likely why you see that name. Oh no, it's a generic noun. It doesn't mean anything, even though they're Canaanite people and they do worship this damn god. And it says a harmonious Semitic root, SRH, meaning either to fight, to contend, to strive, or to rule. Accordingly, the verbal name can either mean the god El fights, which accords with the relatively late popular etymology presented in Genesis 32:29, or the god El supremely rules. Another of the unsolved mysteries remains how the use of the name of Israel for the state that ruled Tirzah in Samaria in the 9th century BCE could be linked with the testimony from the 2nd millennium BC. One possibility is that the name survived in a region from which the Omrides, the founders of the state of Israel, came. It is conceivable that Omri, for whom no biblical genealogy has been transmitted, was in contact with the group that called itself Israel or even belonged to it. The Omride rule then would have brought the name to the political entity. The name Israel was connected with the god El, but the Amorites probably made Yahweh the protective god of the family and national god of the state of Israel. In literary terms, the name Israel is closely linked to the Exodus tradition, the oldest form of which probably functioned as the founding narrative of the Northern Kingdom. Only later was Israel connected with the Jacob tradition. So again, we're revealing this story, this narrative, and how it most likely was placed and pieced together. As we can see, Israel obviously having its Canaanite roots, with the god El being mentioned. I know a lot of people want to hear that because they want to believe in this monotheistic thing, but these people were very polytheistic, and they did believe in the gods of Canaan. I mean, that's abundantly clear. Now, we're moving on to the Exodus in biblical tradition. The biblical account of Exodus begins in the book Genesis. In the Joseph narrative, Genesis 37:45, the sons of Jacob returned to Egypt under Joseph's leadership after the burial of the patriarch Jacob in Hebron. Genesis 50:13-14. Joseph and his father's house remained in Egypt until Joseph dies at the age of 110. His death in the foreign land of Egypt motivates the request that he be buried in the land of Canaan, which occurs in Joshua 24:32. After Joseph's death, Israel's 11 other sons, along with his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, became a great people in Egypt. The initial 70 persons were fruitful and prolific, becoming 603,550 by the time they left Egypt. A few generations after Joseph, which this number is crazy because, again, the maximum number of people in Canaan was like 50,000. So you're talking about 500,000 people, more than 500,000 people sweeping through Canaan. They would have easily crushed everybody, but they didn't. They were struggling, according to the narrative. Don't make no damn sense they had that many people. Another Pharaoh feared the people's huge size, so he oppressed the Israelites with hard labor. He built up 2 storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses, exploiting the Hebrews as slave laborers. Moses, who received a divine calling in Midian at God's mountain, Horeb, together with his brother Aaron, led the negotiations with Pharaoh. These negotiations resulted in the dismissal of the people after the death of the Egyptians' firstborn. After the Israelites, together with the cattle and variety of other people, left Ramesses for Succoth, the group made a detour through the desert toward the Sea of the Reeds, and first camped at Etham. According to Exodus 14, the Israelites had to turn back in order to pitch their camp before Pi Haroth, between Migdol and the sea. When Pharaoh learned that the Israelites had followed his command to leave, he changed his mind, pursued the people with 600 chariots. At Pi Haroth, before Baal Zephon, and at Yahweh's command, Moses miraculously divided the sea with his staff. The sea was displaced by a strong east wind, and at the same time stood on both sides like a wall. Hey, Courtney, if you're watching, how the hell is this even possible? Like, you can try to naturalize this story, but this is all mythical right here. The Egyptians followed the Israelites, but were caught by the water flowing back, while the Israelites crossed the sea dry-footed. After this miraculous saving act, the people under the leadership of Moses moved toward the promised land after visiting the mountain of God in the desert of Sinai. I'm pretty sure everybody knows this story that's listening. They also made a longer stop at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. From there, scouts were sent to the land of Canaan and brought back a grape from the valley of Eshcol, or Valley of Grapes. Since the people repeatedly rejected the leadership of Moses and Aaron, and then since the scout narrative, they questioned the land as a promised gift, the Exodus generation was condemned to die in the wilderness. Numbers 14:34. And this is why I say, if this story actually happened, why don't we see any bodies? And why we don't see material culture? We know they had gold. According to the narrative, they looted the Egyptians. They would have a lot of material culture somewhere in this damn desert. We don't see it, and we just don't see it. So it's like this thing is archaeologically invisible, possible because it's a damn confabulation. I hate to hurt your feelings, but that's just the case. This was followed by 40 years in the wilderness, during which Israel moved from one desert station to another. Because of the king of Edom's refusal to let Israel pass through his land, and like we read in Finkelstein's The Bible on Earth, there were no kings of Edom during this time. So letting you know this is written in a different time period when there were kings of Edom. And they just basically retroactively put that into the story. So Israel had to take a detour and arrive at Moab via the desert. This is where the first disputes with the resident population took place. The whole land of Transjordan was taken and distributed to the Reubenites, Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. Israel camped in Shittim in the plain opposite of Jericho. Again, another red flag. Like, this is a made-up narrative. If there's 600,000 people, or even half that, none of these people here in Canaan is stopping them. None of them. They're just going to rush ride everybody. They're going to run over them. Like we know what the population density most likely look like in these areas. They're going to run over them. So, that just hurts the credibility of this narrative. It says here, with Deuteronomy, Moses gave a great speech recapitulating the history of Horeb to the present day on the last day of his life. After the full 40 years, Moses died in Transjordan on the Mount Nebo, and the people crossed the Jordan into Cisjordan under Joshua's leadership. The Exodus from a historical perspective. Look at these two sentences right here. Can y'all guess what these two sentences say? Can y'all guess what these two sentences read? The Exodus, as the Bible describes it, is not historical. And this is ultimately why my man Pots and Pans, Courtney, lost that debate against the chief executioner, Cedric Ortega. Because you cannot, there's no shred of evidence. There isn't. It's not historical. It says the main reason for this clear statement from a historical perspective is as follows. The chronology of the Exodus. The biblical chronology, which dates the Exodus after a 430-year stay in Egypt and 480 years before the beginning of the temple building, represents a theological construct. This would set the Exodus around 1440 BCE under Pharaoh Thutmose III. This dating would then contradict the Israelites' participation in the construction of the cities of Ramesses, named Ramesses after Ramesses II. So he's pointing out anachronisms, because Ramesses II is 1279 to 1213 BCE. Thutmose is 1479 to 1425 BCE. Exodus routes. The routes reported for Israel's departure contradict each other or do not result in a meaningful Exodus journey. The priestly texts describe the Exodus by a way of horse along the Via Maris, Via Pi-Hahiroth, and Baal Zephon. The non-priestly texts are distinct from this in that they depict a route leading from Pithom and Succoth through the Bitter Lakes into the desert. Both do not lead directly to southern Sinai Peninsula or to Midian. That is to where God's mountains presumably stood. Numbers 33 simply juxtaposes these conflicting geographical indications and fill the gaps with partly invented stations. And this is why I keep telling y'all, this is an invention. This is an invention. These things were clearly confabulations, but you guys want to sit up and argue it and then lose the debate and get mad that you lost. Crazy work. It says the geographical blur can be seen particularly clearly in the localization of the Sea of Reeds. This varies between Lake Serbonus on the Mediterranean Sea, the Bitter Lakes in the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, or nearby Bala Lakes and Lake Timsah. I know y'all watching this. Some of y'all getting your feelings hurt. It's like, you always get your feelings hurt because reality never agrees with the shit y'all believe. You got abos believing that all African Americans, 98% of them are Native American, and the people we call real Native Americans are Maragooks and all this other crazy, the Black Hebrew Israelites believing that they the real Israelites, and y'all all got this bullshit, these bullshit ass ideologies. So when you're met with hard facts, you curl up. Just accept reality. Why is it so hard to just accept reality and face the damn facts? Why is it so damn hard? Kadesh Barnea, the Oasis Kadesh, in which, remember, he's listing all the reasons why the Exodus is not historical. This is another reason. So he brought up the Exodus route. He brought up the chronological argument, which makes it anachronistic. And in the routes, dealing with the routes, we see clearly that they had to invent stations and stuff of that nature that don't exist because it was two different routes described in the scriptures, and none of them, directed them to where they were supposed to go. So they had to, patch that hole, patch that gap, and make up some stations to say that, oh, they were here. I'll skip this part right here. The size of the Exodus group, according to the biblical accounts, in Exodus 12:37, Numbers 11:21, the Bible suggests 600,000 persons left Egypt, and Numbers 146 and 232 even suggests 603,550 able-bodied adult men had departed. It would be impossible for such a group to survive in the desert. The water resources of the natural springs are not sufficient for this. Apart from that, there are no archaeological traces of a 40-year-long mass migration in the late Bronze Age. Within the entire Sinai Peninsula, none of the Israelite camps listed in Numbers 33 can be archaeologically proven, nor are the camps plausible from an archaeological point of view. This is why the shit is archaeologically invisible. This is one of the reasons why I'm not seen as historical. Even if you try to reduce the numbers, they say, oh no, it's actually bands. 60,000 is too many. 60,000. If you say it's 60,000, it's too goddamn many people. To not have no traces of this, oh no, we got to dig too deep in the sand. I've heard all these arguments. We don't have any traces, no material culture, no Egyptian gold, no nothing. Nothing. No weapons, no nothing. Smells like malarkey. Now we can go to Kadesh Barnea. The oasis Kadesh, in which Israel is said to have stayed several times and once for a longer time, was not inhabited during the late Bronze Age. In the late 8th century BCE, a huge rectangular fort of 60 by 40 meters with 8 massive towers was set up. It existed until the Persian period. The earliest phase is dated by radiocarbon and ceramic analysis to the 12th through 10th centuries BCE. This substratum continued into substratum 4b, which persisted into the 8th century BCE. The remains cannot be attributed to an early oval fortress, but rather to a small settlement or a way station of Darb el Ghazi, a trade route that leads from the Gulf of Eilat to Gaza. The massive rectangular fortress was built only by the 8th century BCE in stratum 3 and 2. Thus, until the 8th century BCE, the oasis Kadesh was obviously not that important. So again, another hole here. Again, these are all the reasons why the Exodus is not historical. They claim to be at a place that was not even in service at this time. It's not in service in the alleged time. If you put it in the 15th century, it's not in service then. If you put it in the 13th century, it's not used then. We don't see it until the 8th century BC. So another anachronism. It says about 3 kilometers southeast of Kadesh Barnea in El Qudis, a large 10th century BCE casemate wall structure was identified by Y. Aharoni and excavated by R. Cohen. It's not clear that this structure can be called a fortress, so it should not be associated with King Solomon building activities. However, some hold on to the view that Kadesh Barnea Stratum 4 was built up by the early monarchy by Solomon. Be that as it may, the archaeological evidence cannot substantiate that the Israelites stayed in Kadesh. The same applies to the city of Arad mentioned in the context of wilderness narrative Numbers 21:1, in the Transjordan city of Heshbon 21, 25, and 26, in the Port Ezon Geber 33, 35, 36. There's multiple places that, according to the narrative, they were at. It's literally impossible for them to be there. These places were not of importance. They were not being occupied and were not in use. More holes, right? More holes. More holes. You got to go and dig some holes, digging up them holes. So the next argument is Moses' historicity. The paramount person Moses appears in no known Egyptian sources and eludes a historical location. His name, which derives from the Egyptian Moses or Messi to give birth, and only in folk etymology from Hebrew Meshi to pull out, Exodus 2 and 10, represent a short form in which the theophoric element has been elided. So that whatever God that was connected to his name is missing. Like we brought up earlier, thought Moses, Ramesses, like that. It's usually connected. It's a theophoric name. Like born of Ra, born of whatever thoughts God is, but time Moses maybe, I don't know. Thus, the person lacks any identifiable traces in the extra biblical context. This is reflected in the blurred information on Moses. Amen messes, drawn out of Amen, on Moses' family history. The degree to which Moses represents a biblically stylized figure whose depiction takes its inspiration from existing traditions is shown by the proximity of his birth narrative to the Sargon legend. The biography of Moses was developed in the Neo-Assyrian period in the 8th century BCE, and like the later genealogy, has no reference to a historical person in the 13th century BC. Yeah, him floating in the basket, that motif is literally seen in the Neo-Assyrian legend of Sargon. So you can see where they extrapolated that from. Lack of contemporary sources. For the time of the 19th to 20th first dynasties, neither a mass flight nor a mass expulsion of Semites from Egypt can be proven. Egyptian sources are completely silent about the Exodus. It is true that the Egyptian documents of the 13th century BC, particularly the Pianas, acknowledge migrations of Semitic people into the Nile Delta, but none of these sources can be related to the Exodus event as such. While Papyrus Anastasi admittedly uses Semitic loanwords, this cannot be taken as evidence for Hebrews or Proto-Israelites in Wadi et Tumalet. Even attempts to find an echo of historical Exodus in the classical historical representations of Diodorus Siculus, which Hectasis of Abdera reproduces, can only increase the plausibility of, but not prove the historicity of the event. Without the biblical narratives, no historian would assume that there had been an Exodus. There's your problem. We don't have any corroborating evidence to this at all. We don't. All y'all do is speculate. That's all y'all do. Since none of the biblical evidence is contemporary and its source value remains limited, the search for historical evidence of an Exodus is futile. Then he gives these three guys here: Thomas L. Thompson, John Van Setters, Lester L. Grab. Almost all extra biblical references to the Exodus depend on the biblical representation. Inscription 4.3 from Kuntilat Agrud from the 8th century BCE was introduced into the discussion as the earliest extra biblical reference to the Exodus. However, the 7 lines of the plaster inscription on a door jamb are very fragmentary, and a lexemic connection to the Exodus in the words of Ned Yum, a heap of water, and sea remains essentially guesswork. In some, there are justified doubts that the suggested reading is correct and that it can be invoked as a reference to the Exodus. Here's the next point on why the Exodus is not historical: the location of Sinai. In terms of religious history, the origins of Yahweh worship remains in the dark. The biblical tradition knows Yahweh as the God of the Hebrews, who was mediated by Moses to the Israelites in Egypt. Moses experienced the name Yahweh in a revelation on the mountain of God, which is called Sinai or Horeb in the biblical narrative. This mountain lies beyond the wilderness in Midian and cannot be clearly located even today. The connection with the 2,285 mile high Mount Moses, Gebel Musa, originates from the Christian pilgrim tradition. Already in late antiquity, monks settled at the foot of this mountain. Under Justinian I, a monastery, later called St. Catherine's Monastery, shout out to the Catholic gang, VM, Fifth Street Catholic, was built there to mark the supposed location of the burning thorn bush. The nearby 2,637 mile high Mount Catherine was included in the identification by the pilgrims, so that Sinai and Horeb became different mountains. In the biblical tradition, Horeb is an artificial name that was chosen in the 8th century BC in place of Sinai. But it did not completely supplant the name Sinai. Horeb and Sinai are on the same mountain, but whether they are located in a remote region of around Mount Catherine is uncertain. In the academic discussion, therefore, Gebel, Sabal, and Wadi Faran has been preferred, but this also does not lie in Midian, which is closely connected with the mountain of God via Exodus 2:15, 16, 3:1, and 4:19, due to the volcanic association and description of Theophany in Exodus 19:18. The 2,580 mile high Gebel El Laws in Saudi Arabia was also proposed as an option for Mount Sinai, This mountain is easier to connect to Midian due to its location, but its localization in northern Arabia has other problems. Thus, it can hardly be connected with other place names mentioned or meaningfully integrated into one of the biblical Exodus routes. It is also presupposes the identification of the Sea of Reeds with the Gulf of Iliad. Whether this localization belongs to the oldest or latest strata of the Exodus narrative, however, is disputed. Each attempt to locate Sinai has its own geographical or literary historical problems. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of trying to find Mount Ararat. It's the same issue. It's the same exact issue. We can't find it. We don't know where it's at. We just guess it. Well, probably because it's mythical. It's like trying to find Mount Olympus. Anyway, the same issues also apply to the attempt to locate Sinai according to Numbers 33, 1 through 50. The list of stations in which the entire route of the desert migration from Ramesses to steppes of Moab is listed by indicating the camp stations. Turns out on closer inspection not to be an old list, but a very late construct that is less concerned with topographic precisions than with a complete compilation of the locations of the wilderness narratives. Thus, the reconstruction of old pilgrimage path to the Sinai, which Martin Knopf wanted to glean from Numbers 33, is superfluous. This attempt failed not least because of the doubtful existence of a later pilgrimage to God's mountain. On the contrary, the biblical tradition seems to lack any interest in topographically precise location of the mountain of God and rather prefers to obscure it in a network of literally dense traditions. All historicizing identifications, therefore, inevitably led nowhere, meaning we don't know where the hell this mountain is. Anyway, Mount Sinai cannot be topographically located or identified. From this, it follows, on the one hand, that such statement in the biblical narratives must not be reduced to their supposed historical value. The Exodus narrative is not intended to be understood as reporting a historical event. It is myth rather than history. Boy. A hard pill to swallow, right? It establishes a collective identity and memory. There is a consensus that the literary form emerged long after the events narrated. That is several centuries later. The earliest tangible form of the Exodus narrative dates no earlier than the 8th century BC. However, not all individual features of the narrative can be derived from the 8th or 7th century BC. On the other hand, it must be asked whether such an effective founding myth as the Exodus can do without any reference to historical events. That is, can such a market tradition be a complete fabrication? As this question is to be answered in the negative, it makes sense to talk about the narrative's historical plausibility. However, there are different opinions on what the Exodus narrative may have preserved. All right, various historical contexts of the Exodus tradition. The historical setting of the Exodus story have been discussed since the beginning of historical criticism. Within this process, the dating of the Exodus story, it's assumed historicity, and the information on the historical entanglement of the southern Levant and Egypt has led to various settings for the Exodus event. In each case, the argument is dependent on theories of literary history, which implies a certain circularity in their reasoning. Yeah, you're always going to go to circular reasoning trying to find this because it's myth. It is myth. What are the things that are historical behind this? Again, I already told you, it seems as if the motif or the idea of, Egyptians chasing Semites out of Egypt is hearkening back to the Hyksos, because it's the only time we see it. It's the only time we see something like that happen. So here's all of the historical arguments here, what time period they belong in. The 18th dynasty Thutmose or Hatshepsut, the biblical chronology taken for granted, 480 years before building Solomon's temple, and that's how people come to that date. That's the traditional Exodus date. What the modern consensus is where they place it is the 19th, which is 1304 to 1224 BC, and basically it's based off of Pithom and Ramesses being mentioned in Exodus 111, and involving West Asian corvée workers. The 20th, which is what Betok believes in, he believes more of the 20th dynasty, and that will be Seknati or Ramesses III. And it says the Exodus narrative reflects Egyptian dominance over the province of Canaan. So we know at the end of the 20th, or in the 20th, the Egyptians lose their grip over Canaan. If you're looking at a symbolic exodus, that will be a symbolic exodus as well. Like, oh, when the Egyptians lose control over Canaan, and then the Canaanites themselves, calling themselves Israelites and whatnot, begin to, or the other Moab and Edom and all those other groups, been able to, they go from there and they establish themselves in the grand scheme of things. 21st and 22nd, 968-75 BC, Osarkan and Susanes the parallel the Corvée under Solomon and Rehoboam is decisive for dating the Exodus tradition. The 26th was Sasamaiticus and Necho II. This is what Finkelstein was talking about, that, this is all symbolic as well, with the Egyptians renewing their dominance in the southern Levant and Josiah creating a narrative to combat that. Anyway, it says checking the historical plausibility of the Exodus events can begin from several different angles. With the concrete dates on sites, the Exodus routes, the persons mentioned, the oppression narrated. Thus, one can also arrive at different results. Anything that can change on a whim is arbitrary. But anyway, the archaeologist William G. Dever holds the view that it's not necessary to adhere to the Exodus as an event in Israel's prehistory because Israel originated in Canaan. This makes the search for historical points of contact between the biblical narrative and the Egyptian history superfluous. Nadav Naaman, who sees the origin of Exodus tradition in the history of the Egyptian province of Canaan in the 19th and 20th dynasties, reached a similar position. De facto, the Exodus did not take place in Egypt at all, but in Canaan, and refers to the separation of the province of Canaan from Egyptian dominance. That's what I was telling you about. It's more of a moral thing. It's not a physical thing. Talk of the Exodus is a metaphor from the outset. The collective memory that was preserved centuries later in the Exodus narrative moved the events from Canaan to Egypt. The problem with these solutions is twofold. One, on one hand, they cannot explain why so little of the late Bronze Age situation in Canaan, which supposedly informed its origins, has been preserved in the Exodus narrative. On the other hand, the Mosaic tradition in the origins of Yahweh, who is inseparably connected with the biblical tradition as the God of Exodus, remain open questions that speak against an origin of the Exodus tradition exclusively within Canaan. Most researchers, on the other hand, assume the Exodus tradition, the tradition historical connection of Yahweh with Sinai, and the mediation of the belief of Yahweh to Israel can be better explained if one assumes the existence of a group of people who lived in Egypt in the concluding 2nd millennium BCE, whose memory has been preserved in the Exodus tradition. With Rainer Alberts, it is to be noted that the use of the Exodus as a founding myth for Israel in literature for the 1st millennium BC, possibly connected with the foundation of the state of Israel under the Amorites and the Nimshites, does not exclude its historical origin in events of the 2nd millennium BC. In addition, there have been alternative proposals for the derivation of the Exodus tradition. For example, an anti-Egyptian narrative against Pharaoh Necho II, or an anti-Assyrian narrative against Esar-Haddon. So again, that's what Pharaoh Necho II, this is what Finkelstein was talking about, that it was just an anti-Egyptian polemic against the Egyptians because they were ruling over Canaan again in the 7th century BC. But so far, these have not been completely convincing, since the biblical tradition had precursors and the Exodus tradition is more strongly connected to the north than to the south. The argument that the Exodus tradition is rooted in the separation of Canaan from the foreign rule of Egypt only at the end of the 20th dynasty and then found its way into collective memory also has the problem that the end of the Egyptian rule was not so abrupt that it could captivate the collective memory as a specific event. The fact that nothing decisively contradicts the flight or forced migration of Shashu groups from the Eastern Delta region after the expulsion of the Hyksos in the middle of 2nd millennium BC stands alongside the lack of any positive evidence. That is, while nothing precludes such an exodus, nothing affirms it either, and that's why they're in a quagmire. That is exactly why they're in a quagmire. This remains particularly true during the late Ramesside period of the 19th and 20th dynasties under Pharaohs Ramesses II, Meneptah, Sethos, Segnati. Therefore, seeking the plausibility of Exodus account as a historical event does not mean possibly affirming it. And that's where y'all get tripped up. Rather, it means examining what might command tracing the tradition's roots to Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC. That's it. Where they getting these ideas from, pretty much. The presence of West Asians in now Delta region at the end of the 2nd millennium BC. I might stop it here. I know we're close to the end of the chapter, but it's almost 12. Let's see how much I got left here. 74. Damn, we got law. Yeah, we got into 70. I'm gonna finish it. I'm going over the time. I did not want this to be too long, but I did want to read the whole chapter. So we're at the hour and 50-minute marker. Might as well finish it. You know what I'm saying? Presence of the West Asians in now Delta region at the end of the second millennium BCE. The presence of southern Levantine people from Syria and Palestine and Egypt is undisputed and well documented in Egyptian materials. They came as economic refugees or as prisoners of war to the Nile Delta area. There they were deployed as foreign workers and mercenaries and sometimes rose to the highest state of offices. Some of the toponyms of the Nile Delta used in Egyptian texts supposedly have Semitic origin, which may also indicate the influence of West Asians in the area. The land of Chajeku mentioned in Papyrus Anastasi 5 is reminiscent of the biblical Sukkot, which is mentioned as the first station of the Exodus after Ramesses. The land of Goshen in which Jacob's family resided, which is mentioned in the Joseph story, and twice in Exodus, is perhaps to be located in Wadi Tumalat. The Septuagint replaces Goshen in Genesis 46, 28, 29, but only there with Heronopolis. Heronopolis, is that? I guess that's what the city of Heronopolis, which is located at Tel El Mashuda, a place related to Pithom. The most important documents in this context are two letters of Pianastasi, which report the escape of foreign laborers from Chajeku, supposedly equivalent to Sukkot, and the migration policy regarding a group of Shashu from Edom, respectively. According to Manford, the deportation practice of the Egyptians and the defense of the West Asians associated with the trauma of over-alienation represent a plausible motif for an escape of the Aporia and Shashu groups from Egypt, especially in the context of exaggerated claims to power of the Ramesside era. Next segment, Yahweh in Exodus. And this was brought up by my brother Courtney. He was like, oh, you got people leaving. They got slaves escaping. I'm like, still, this is not positive proof for an Exodus. It's not. Slaves escaping. That's all you got. You don't have a smoking gun. Anyway, Yahweh in the Exodus. Within the biblical presentation, there is close connection between Yahweh and Exodus. Literally, both are virtually indissolubly linked. If it is assumed that the oldest Exodus narrative originated as a narrative that established the identity of the northern kingdom of Israel, a founding myth, a charter myth, the God of Exodus belongs to the self-understanding which is most plausible for the time of the Amorites. All of Ahab's children suddenly carry Yahweh containing theophoric personal names. And the epigraphic evidence and seals and inscriptions also points to the intensification of Yahweh worship in the 8th century BC. Via his function as the dynastic and national god, Yahweh was then mediated to Judah. And in the late 8th century BC, connected with a pan-Israel perspective. While this hypothesis contains a high level of speculation due to the lack of evidence from the late Bronze Age, it can be reliably assumed that the deity Yahweh was not an indigenous Canaanite deity, but came from outside. Even to this day, no extra biblical evidence locates him in Canaan in the Middle Bronze Age or Late Bronze. The only clue remains the name, which, following the hypothesis of Julius Wellhausen, derives from the old North Arabian verbal root hawa, to blow. If the origin of the weather god Yahweh from Northwest Arabia or the southern Transjordan is still plausible, then the Shashu groups of Edom, Seir are of particular importance for the connection of Yahweh with the Exodus. The Egyptians brought Shashu, who were used as miners for copper extraction, to Timnah, Wadi Amaniye, and Fanan in the Araba region, as well as to Egypt. Besides Shashu from Seir, Shashu from Yahweh, which could possibly be associated with the deity Yahweh, are mentioned in lists of place names in Egyptian temples of Memphis III, and Soleb in Sudan, and then probably depended on the above, in inscriptions of Ramesses II in Amara West. For it is by no means illogical that the god bearing the same name as the region to which the group of the Shashu was assigned was also connected with the Shashu group. Thus, the Shashu could have mediated the faith to the Exodus group. This hypothesis is a modern variant of the so-called Kenite-Midianite hypothesis. According to this biblically based hypothesis, metalworking Kenites in the Araba or Midianites in northern Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula mediated Yahweh to the Israelites, which is completely different from the biblical narrative. Completely different, because in the biblical narrative, Yahweh is given to him in the mountain, and this thing was already known. Some of y'all will say it's already known in Genesis, and so it completely contrasts with that. However, this hypothesis also has weakness because it must presuppose what it seeks to prove. Evidence of early worship of Yahweh in Palestine between the 12th and 9th centuries is completely lacking. It is not entirely clear whether the Shashu groups can be located in southern Palestine and where exactly they're in. The other names on the list refer to Syria, Palestine as a whole, and the bottleneck to the south stems from the connection with the Shashu from Seir. The God of Israel's southern origin, and thus also his connection with the Exodus, and Sinai have no alternative support in the history of tradition. Even if Judges 5:4-5, Psalm 68:8, Habakkuk 3:3, and Deuteronomy 33:2 do not belong to the pre-monarchic or early monarchic period. In contrast, the idea that these texts theologically constructed Yahweh's origin from the south only in Hellenistic period, or that the earliest connection between Yahweh, Egypt, and the Exodus occurred in the 8th century BCE seems unlikely. If one is forced to speculate, the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis currently presents the only hypothesis that can explain Yahweh's origin in connection with the Exodus. Moving on to the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Again, we're reading all of the things that make the Exodus narrative unhistorical or ahistorical. Exodus 1:11 states that the Israelites were used for forced labor in the building of the supply cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Pithom is the house of the god of Atum, can be found at Wadi et Tumalet, which connects the eastern Nile Delta with Lake Timsah. A stela of Ramesses II was found at Tel El Mashuda. That mentions Pithom, however you say that. Additionally, at the site, the so-called Pithom Stela of Ptolemy II provides the name of the places of, I'm guessing that's Pithom. Those who wish to prove the ahistorical nature of the Exodus like to point out that Tel El Mashuda was only resettled at the end of the 7th century BCE, and the Stela of Ramesses II must have been moved there secondarily. This, however, raises the question to which Pithom the Stela refers. It may have come from the western Tel El Rotabi, where an older border fortress stood. Ramesses II built an tomb temple there, and Ramesses III reinforced the local fortresses to ward off the sea peoples after 600 BCE, and the place was abandoned for 200 years. Tel El Mashuda could have been the successor settlement of Tel Er Rotabe when Pharaoh Necho II was reconstructing a channel to the Red Sea. Tel Er Rotabe would then be Pithom, which also bore the name Succoth. The locations of Ramesses is much more difficult because there are several cities named Ramesses in Egypt. The full title of the city in Egyptian text is Pa-Ramesses, some House of Ramesses, the beloved of Amun, great and victorious strength. It is possible that the Bible has employed a shortened form, but even then, one will respect Pa-Ramesses rather than Ramesses. The fact that the transliteration of the city's name in Hebrew rather follows the phonetics of the first millennium BC does not contradict locating the city in the 13th, 12th century BCE, so long as it is accepted that the textual version of the Exodus narrative dates from later times. If one assumes that it refers to the most significant Ramesses city of Pa-Ramesses, this was located near the old Hisco city of Avaris in the eastern delta on the Pelusian Nile arm. Pa-Ramesses was extensively developed by Ramesses II. Since the excavation of Manfred Betok and Edgar Push, Ramesses has been identified with Tel Adaba, today's Qantir, replacing the former identification with Tanis. The city of Pithom, built on several square kilometers, was one of the largest copper processing plants in southern Levant, where more than 1,000 tons of bronze were produced in almost industrial fashion every day at peak times. High temperature technology also permitted the production of ruby red glass and turquoise blue, Egyptian faience, in large quantities. The raw materials came from copper mining areas such as Oman, Timna, Sinai, Fanan, and Araba region, as well as Cyprus. The excavation points to a large number of foreign workers from Eastern Mediterranean and especially the southern Levant. Although the archaeological findings at Pithom and Ramesses cannot prove the Exodus, they do not contradict the assumption that some West Asian Semitic people groups who were initially employed there as foreign workers fled or were expelled from Egypt as an Exodus group. Now, see, people will take this and be like, oh, see, the Exodus happened. No, it's not saying the biblical Exodus happened. It's saying some of the motifs, the ideas that we do find in there may be some historical kernels there. That's all that's saying. It's although the Pharaoh of Exodus is not named in the biblical narratives, a connection between the Exodus and Ramesses II remains historically possible in principle. In any case, there are no compelling reasons to assume that Pharaoh was Necho II, which has also been introduced several times as an alternative. Finkelstein, Wolfgang, Oswald. The motif of forced labor in a foreign country is central in all strands of the Exodus tradition. Just like the redemption from slavery, the harsh treatment belongs to a central component of the Exodus motif, which reaches even to the motivation of laws. It cannot simply be derived from later history. Although there are close links between the forced labor under Solomon and his successor Rehoboam. In the Exodus tradition, Solomon's reign does not provide any de facto historical evidence for broad state-organized obligation for people or foreigners to work. It is not easy to find a historical point of connection for the formation of these traditions in later history, since the motif certainly did not come into being in or after the exile. Or references to the reign of Manasseh are hardly sufficient. But our skipper has strengthened the interpretation that forced labor relates to Pharaoh Necho II. Exodus 1:11 is a Judean memory of Egyptian hegemony in the late 7th century BC, which was accompanied by coercive measures and oppression. The Greek writer Herodotus reports about Necho's 120,000 workers who were employed to build the canal from the Gulf of Suez to the Nile Delta. The hypothesis assumes a lot, but it's possible. However, as long as there is nothing compelling against the reference to Ramesses II, a late 7th century background need not necessarily be given preference, especially since it has problems with the widely recognized setting of the Exodus narrative in the northern kingdom of Israel. Thus, the idea that the Exodus narrative is connected to an old memory of forced labor by homeless and lawless West Asian Semites, most likely Shashu farmers, as foreign workers in Egypt remains a plausible alternative. At least the identity-creating function of this central memory can be better explained in this way. The situation was undoubtedly associated with repression and a high level of social violence on the part of Egyptian builders, which also reflected in the Exodus narrative. The fact that the production of bricks from clay and straw fits well in the Egyptian context is not decisive, but supporting of the argument. So again, that kernel right there, West Asians being slaves, possibly Shasu, and maybe that's why you have the Yahweh narrative or the Yahweh God so intentionally attached to the Exodus narrative itself. Probably as Joshua. Bitak believes the same thing. So that portion could be historical, quote unquote, but the biblical Exodus is not historical. Again, that's what we're reading here. These are all arguments why it's not historical. But we got these little segments that they're taking from actual historical events and weaving it into a national narrative. Next segment, flight or expulsion from Egypt. Based on Egyptian documents, several departures are conceivable in the late Ramesside period, the memory of which could have been preserved in the Exodus tradition. Particular attention should be given to this period of unrest associated with upheavals before Ramesses III. As cited when, according to the document of Papyrus of Harris I and the so-called Elephantine Stela of Sagnati around 1185-84, West Asians were expelled from Egypt. The extent to which the administrative functionary Beja, who played a decisive role in the unrest, can be connected with Moses, and thus grant a historical point of connection for the biblical figure, is discussed in research as the proposals see Moses as a redepiction of Amenephis IV, or Akhenaten. In his monotheistic reform, in both hypotheses, the problems predominate due to a lack of or very late historical starting points. Manfred suggestion to see Moses as a corporate personality comparable to the patriarchs also solves the problem of the figure's unprovable historicity by resorting to the formation of the tradition. So basically, corporate personality, a fancy way of seeing a made-up figure for political purpose. That's literally what Manfred B. Tech is saying, or B. Talk is saying. Now we're at the summary. We got to the end of this. This is the summary. I'm gonna read it, motherfucker, man. We support literature here on Genesis 49ers, YAP to the death of me, Yap gang. We actually read here. You guys just run your goddamn mouth. We actually read. Anyway, historically, one cannot advance beyond uncertainty about the person of Moses, who certainly bear an Egyptian name. But the historicity of an event that is remembered as an exodus from Egypt does not depend on the question of whether Moses is a historical person, a remembered figure, or both. An Exodus tradition without Moses is literally unlikely. If there had been an Exodus group that interpreted the disengagement with Egypt as liberation, that connected this experience with the God Yahweh, and that conveyed this experience to later Israel, then this group was relatively small. Judged from the Exodus conquest narrative, the first point of connection occurred in the north, most likely in the Ephraimite hill country. Perhaps this tradition was preserved and transmitted by the clan from which the Amorites originated, and was elaborated to form the founding myth with the foundation of the state in the 9th century BC. The Exodus from Egypt, interpreted as liberation, was connected from its beginning with the deity Yahweh. From a historical point of view, it is no longer possible to reconstruct the details of the Exodus event. Instead, one is referred to enduring meaningful power of this myth of origin. Again, it's not historical. It was used as a purpose. Did they take certain motifs that actually may have some truth to it? Yes. Shashu being possibly Yahweh worshippers, the fact that West Asians were expelled in the 20th dynasty, stuff like that. Even going back to the Hyksos being chased, the idea of being chased by chariots that we find in Exodus. So I thought we were at the end of this. Yeah, we're at the end. All right, so Exodus and monotheism, an additional historical question which has stood in the foreground. The history of ideas and memories is of particular importance. The Exodus as a departure from slavery is the foundation myth, which is firmly anchored in a collective memory of Judaism and thus also Christianity. John Osman connects the revolutionary detachment from Egyptian culture and religion associated with this memory to the so-called Mosaic distinction between truth and falsehood. The distinction is inextricably linked to monotheism because it must challenge the existence of other gods. And the complex formation of biblical monotheism in the history of religion is in turn inextricably linked to the memory of the Exodus. Through the thesis of Osman, which have been widely discussed in cultural, historical, and social sciences since the publication of Moses the Egyptian, 1998, exclusive monotheism is suspected of being intolerant. The questions raised by Osman are urgent since they touch on the truth questions of religions, as such, and reach into the foundation of political thought. Although they have historical aspects, they cannot be answered historically. The discrediting of the biblical monotheism as inherently violent, which often appears in reception of Osman's thesis, has often rightly met with criticism. In contrast, freedom and fidelity were emphasized as central aspects of the Exodus foundation myth, in contrast to which the question of truth take a backseat. As for any trace of memory about the Exodus that might point to the degradation of Akhenaten in the Egyptian history, this lies outside the question that are appropriate for the history of Israel. And that's the motherfucking deal. That is the chapter, Israel's prehistory. And I wanted to read that just to really show you why the Torah is fictive. The Exodus narrative, the patriarchs, the stories in Genesis, these things are just confabulations. Are there some kernels of truth? Yes, meaning there are some things that come from the second millennium BC that they accurately depict Semites traveling and migrating into Egypt. Definitely did happen. Were there a band of people that possibly worship Yahweh? Yes, that happened. But a lot of the miracles and these episodes of wrestling angels and separating the sea and creating dividing walls and large groups of people going out into the wilderness and going to a place that we don't know exists, that may or may not exist, the Mount Sinai. We don't know where the hell it's at. Just like we don't know what Mount Ararat's at. All these things are confabulations, and it served the purpose for the ethnogenesis of Israel, so they can have a national narrative. And that's the motherfucking deal. YAP to the death of me, Fifth Street Catholic. Shout out to all my Catholics out there. Shout out to Fravel, because Christian Fravel is a Catholic. He holding it down for the gang. We've been on for 2 hours. I gave y'all the chapter. So again, the Torah is fictive. Let's see if anybody debated. VM, I'm out. Gang.
One at a time, I leave a bloody mess at the scene of the crime. Hunting to the blood, I'm always on my grind. Call me single love, got one thing on my mind. Die, single die, single die, single die. Nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. Die, single die, single die, single die. Ain't even no shells, don't need no alibi. Die, single die, single die, single die. I can see the fear hiding in your eye. Science is undefeated and we standing tall, crushing all the scammers, building narrative wall. All that thin flaming, what's wrong with y'all? Swing my battle axe and we watch them fall. I leave them busted, battered and bruised, crushing fragile egos. They call it abuse. I'm putting belt to ass, it's like you're on to lose. You're about to pop a vessel, about to blow a fuse. Your niggas always licking, but I'm never confused. I'm hunting through the blood, I'm always on my grind. Call me single love, got one thing on my mind. Die, so die, so die, so die. Nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. Die, so die, so die, so die. Ain't even no shells, don't need no alibi. Die, so die, so die, so die. I can see the fear hiding in your eye. I see all the hating, it's fine by me. You pseudo-laying scammers are my enemies. All the misinformation is a tragedy. Now I'm in them garden pulling up the weeds. Y'all be the sickness like a fucking disease. I'm a pseudo-killer nigga, got the remedy. So I do this for fun, completely for free. But watch it through the die, it's joy for me. So I'm always through the hunt and I'm always on the grind. Call me single love, got one thing on my mind. Die, so die, so die, so die. Nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. Die, so die, so die, so die. Ain't even no shells, don't need no alibi. Die, so die, so die, so die. I can see the fear hiding in your eyes. Y'all just ain't ready to deal with a pseudo killer nigga. You gotta come with all your flim flam, bullshit, narratives, get crushed every time. Stomping on you niggas every time.